Hi, Dr. Leong. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us and during this Easter season. And in the last couple of months, we heard from you from various channels, especially in the WhatsApp, where we see you answering questions. How have this whole season been for you? Has it been very busy?
It's been very, very busy. I'm a doctor. I'm an infectious disease physician. And what we do and what we are trained for is actually outbreak situations like this. First, there was the Nipah virus. Then 2003 with Sars, where it hit so many people. I was really in the midst of it all. And then now, with COVID. Did I kind of predict COVID? Well, I did actually. I gave many talks on SARS, and I says there was SARS, there'll be cars, there'll be bars, there's Mars, and because of Wuhan, there's now WA.
So I think it's such a privilege to hear from you up close and personal, and to hear you in a different tone from the other interviews that we see online.
Yes.
And but first of all, let's hear from you. What's so fearful about this whole COVID-19 as compared to other viruses?
If you think about it, COVID-19 is no real big deal for the individual you and me. We may need a bit of oxygen. Well, everyone can live with that. Some of us may require breathing machines. That's fine. Then why are we worrying over something like this? The answer is it comes on very quickly. It's very easily transmissible. You see, all of us have our social needs and social structure. The need to shake hands, the need to talk, the need to communicate, to even have lunch with other people. We are social creatures, and God made us social creatures. But this social creatures is how the virus spreads. And the virus is spread onto you, you end up being the Trojan horse. You have no idea what's happening. And it could end up spreading to many people. So the real trouble comes when many people fall sick at the same time, many people requiring hospitalization. Now, if Singapore gets hit very quickly, or 6 million gets hit in a few months, we have at least 1,000, if not more than 1,000 people, new patients going to the hospital every day. We can cope with it the first day, possibly the second day. By the third and fourth day, the hospital is full. You can't admit new people. People start falling sick, staying at home, and dying at home. And this is a real situation because South Korea just reported a person who died at home because he couldn't make it to the hospital. And this could happen to Singapore. If I could control the spread such that only 1,000 people fall sick every month, I'm not worried. But it's not for me to choose. It's up to the virus liking. If the virus chooses to infect many people very quickly, then the whole hospital systems will be overwhelmed. If you have a stroke, you have a heart attack, you have appendicitis, you have a colon cancer, I'm sorry. You are left all alone at home. So that's the problem with COVID-19. Wow. It overwhelms our systems, we can't cope, and many more will die.
So do you think that at the end of the day, science and nature will be able to defeat the virus?
Absolutely. I think science will eventually win over. Science is something which God gave us. It doesn't happen because we research on it, but it's an insight, it's an awareness, an epiphany. So with that science knowledge, we begin to research more and understand more about the virus. Then we realize some of the weaknesses. Some of the weaknesses, like for example, one clear weakness is it has to spread to someone. Let's say between both of us, there's a glass plane. We are seeing each other, or if we want to shake hands, it's through a plastic. I can't come in contact with you. We can see each other. The virus can't cross over. So there are limitations to it. If we break off the social bonds, as in the social structure, the need to see each other, effectively the virus gets contained. And Singapore did just exactly that. It contained the virus by not allowing it to spread to other people. They find one person, look at all the contacts, and contain the contacts. So in turn, the contacts can't pass on to others. So the virus dies within this group of people. But in other cases, such as Iran, Italy, in South Korea, while we're doing this in early March, we see a lot more cases spreading because they are not catching fast enough to the virus. The virus meets new people, spread. Unfortunately, we have to rethink of how we interact in order to beat this virus. And mark my words, it will come to an end. We will control the virus eventually. But during these times, these are trying times.
So glad to hear from you that ultimately we will defeat. And just now, right now is really just a trying season that we have to just go through it and respond correctly. But the interesting thing is that the more talk about thing right now as well is the response of people. In the beginning when it happened, people panicked and we saw that supermarket was being swept out, Yes. But I see that happening not just Singaporeans. At first I thought that it's just ugly Singaporeans. Australians. But everywhere else in the world we are seeing that. How should people really respond then to the virus? How should we go through this trying season and come out strong from it?
I could respond as an individual. I will look after myself, I'll look after my family, make sure I stock up enough food and make sure I have enough masks, and I make sure my family, my kids are doing well in school and continue life as it is. That's very easy. I'm in a comfortable place, I have enough money, I can do this. But no, that's not the right thing to do. God didn't ask me to look after myself, but to look after my neighbor. My neighbor will be anyone whom I meet. It could be my colleagues, it could be my friends, my relatives, my church mates, even to those who are non-Christians. Remember the Good Samaritan. Even to people who are not of Christian faith, we need to reach out to them and we need to help them. And this is where the Christ in us must shine out more than our physical self. I just wish that I could grow a beard perhaps and then be the Christ and emerge out of it, of this Chinese body, and then go and take out Christ's love to each and every single one of them. Make use of technology to overcome these hurdles and live life a little bit different. And it's about adapting, it's about repurposing. That's more important than living your own life looking after yourself. And as you realize that the more you help others, the more the joy you get instead of just looking after your family. Then you get to see the heart of God. I think all of us can do better if we know and feel the pulse of God.
Wow, that's so good. That it's so encouraging to hear this. That actually it's not just we as believers, we are able to encourage others, but those who do not know God as well, they can take these practical steps and do it as well. And the community can change and be different as a result of these things by looking out for one another.
I think in general, Singaporeans are very inward looking. We tend to look after ourselves, our family, our own people.
Exactly.
And we kind of make a distinction whether are you Singaporean or not. But I think we should look beyond that. We should look beyond the shores of Singapore. We should look beyond our families into our neighbours, and beyond neighbours into beyond our church, and beyond our shores into nearby countries. I think many people can benefit simply understanding more about sharing, more about love.
We moved on to something more personal. That I understand that you had an incredible experience with Sars, very personally, back in 2003. How was it like? How was the whole ordeal like? And from it, I also know that you encountered God in it. So tell us more about that.
So as an infectious disease physician, I had the chance to look after many patients. I was still in training when the index patient came into the hospital that was in Tan Tock Seng, where I was working. She was very unusual. She had what we call an atypical pneumonia in a young lady, and she didn't fit into any pattern. Now, during those times in 2003, we had little awareness of all these new and emerging pathogens or new emerging germs. We just knew diagnosis is what it was, and the ability to diagnose conditions were extremely limited. Nonetheless, like a little young boy with a new toy, which he's learning to discover and understand, I took on the case and tried to unravel and understand the condition. But nothing in my textbook, nothing in my training helped me understand or appreciate what was wrong with her. So eventually it turns out that she wasn't the only one. Another patient came in, same story. Someone who had visited Hong Kong came back and sick. And with that, we quarantined both of them in isolation rooms so that no one could come in contact with them. We were possibly playing with a new organism, a new virus, and there's a potential risk that we spread on to other people. So then after, at about day 14 of illness, she recovered and then things got better. We had no answers then. We were all puzzled. What happened was I decided to go to New York. There was a trip for a conference, and I went ahead and went to conference. I was well when I left, but when I reached New York, I felt a little bit unwell. I had fever, I was shivering, I had no cough. I felt lethargic, unwell, something wasn't right. But by evening, the conference started. I went in, attended the conference. I sat at the rear, I was shivering. What was happening? I didn't know what was happening. I was just quite worried. Eventually, I went back to my room, and my wife, who's a doctor, asked, what's wrong? I say, I think I have dengue. I have fever, I have headache, I've got muscle ache. And then look, I'm having a little bit of a rash. It could be dengue. So my wife, like all good wives there are, don't trust your husband at the surface. So we found a travel doctor the next day, and then the doctor actually diagnosed me with pneumonia. Then I started getting worried. Why should I get pneumonia? I have fever, but I didn't quite understand. So the doctor told me, it's no big deal, it's just another pneumonia, take some antibiotics. These are free samples, take it and you'll be fine. Then carry on with the rest of the trip. But I decided against. I decided that I should fly back home to Singapore. So we bought our tickets, and from New York, we flew to Frankfurt and back to Singapore. And before I did that, I made a call to my Sifu, my teacher back in Singapore. And I said, I have pneumonia, I don't know what's happening, but I'm coming back. So this was at about 12 midnight Singapore. So I took the next flight back home. I was flying through Frankfurt when Singapore was 8 a.m. the next morning. They had a discussion, and they realized that people were breaking down with pneumonia, they were falling sick, and they didn't know what was happening. All of them looked very similar in the clinical pattern, in the x-rays and the blood tests. There were lots of discussions. The Ministry of Health convened a meeting with all doctors from different hospitals. At the end of the meeting, there's always any other business. It was then when my teacher put out the hand and say, there's one doctor who possibly looked after one of the patients, who was the index patient, who has pneumonia and is flying back to Singapore as we speak. So they were very frantic. They tried to hunt me down. But because I took an earlier flight, they couldn't find me. Eventually they did. They found me on board the plane, and they took us and moved us right at the back. So we moved at the back. They quarantined us a few rows all the way to the rear. All the people who just moved compacted to the front. Were easily about 40 seats at the back that's left to us. It was during this time then I started wondering what was happening back in Singapore. We had our phone, we had a cordless phone, but it was really a 2G phone. You couldn't do anything more than sending a short message or calling. There wasn't any internet. There wasn't any connection to the world. And certainly the newspapers didn't talk about it. So it's during this time then I started wondering if this is a new virus altogether with a propensity to cause an epidemic. My concerns went to my wife who was pregnant. My concerns went to my mother-in-law. And I wanted to prepare her. So I told her, Mom, people will come and get us later on. They will come in spacesuits. Okay, they will look very weird. In fact, don't get frightened. And guess what she said?
What?
It's okay, don't worry. I've watched TV before. So, and indeed, the people in spacesuits came to get us after our planes were landed at Frankfurt at an obscure part. Then they took us down, and then I was admitted to Frankfurt Hospital. My mother-in-law had fever that morning, so she was quarantined with me in a very simple room with all the facilities for intensive care. It was soon established that she didn't really have a fever, she didn't have any infection, so I was left to myself. Then my wife, who was well, was sleeping in the next room. But because she was well, they kept us apart. Thereafter, my infection went worse, I became more and more breathless, and I knew what's the meaning of breathlessness. My oxygen went down to about 89, 91%. I was literally panting for my breath. So in the midst of all this, my wife started developing a fever. She developed a cough. And then they realized that we probably had the same illness, and then she was taken in and she joined us all together. So during this time, they swabbed me, they took me, and then they identified the virus. They saw it, they grew it, and from there, from my virus, which they isolated from me, they developed a test kit to diagnose SARS coronavirus, and this was sent out and became the standard testing for SARS coronavirus. We also, from my blood, I could also develop antibodies that became the positive control in any reaction to show whether you have the virus or have not had the viral infection. So after 21 days, we were finally released and allowed back home to Singapore. It was a long journey. I, as a doctor, appreciated what it felt like to be a patient. I, as a doctor, knew what breathlessness was. I, as a patient, knew what it felt like for a tube to go down my lungs. I, for a patient, knew what it meant when your life flashed past you. You learned to think about what was important. You learned to think about your friends. You learned to think about your family. And you learned to think about what happens next. Where do I go? Do I go to God? Do I go to hell? Certainly, it didn't matter about what car and what house and how many credit cards I had. But more importantly, relationship. And more importantly, what's going to happen to me? I wasn't really worried about death, actually. As a doctor, we encountered death. I was more afraid of suffering.
And how did you then come and know God and accepted Jesus into your life?
You see, every single thing in life happens for a reason. Every single thing in life happens for a purpose. When the doors were open and she joined me, then she fell sick. I became better. That it was me, I just had to do something. I had no internet, I had no books. I was really begging to do something. So this happened in Germany. And you couldn't find anything English. There was nothing else to read except one book. The Bible. My wife said, Luke was a physician. Read his word.
She told you that?
She told me that. So I took her the book, the Gospel, according to Luke, and read it. I read it at the end, all the way to the end of the book. At the end of it all, I was really quite convinced by what the story told me. And then I had to come up with a couple of conclusions. Number one, truly, Jesus Christ was exactly the man who described him to be. Or two, he was incredibly charismatic. But for some reason, his teaching went on for the next 2,000 years. And people being persecuted for it. But it still went on for the next 2,000 years. So I had to struggle between these two. When I ended up with those two questions, life just stopped there. I went back to Singapore and went back to busyness. The usual training as a physician, as a doctor, you just go through the rigors of it all. Sometimes you feel like a lab rat just running through non-stop. Until in 2003, I went on to further studies in London. You see, God has a funny way of doing things. It takes you out of your lab rat running mode and puts you in a very, very uncomfortable position. So as London the next 3 years, I attended a church called Chinese Church in London. And that's where I encountered friends. I had a wonderful friend called Marcus Andrews. Marcus and I started talking. I have various questions about Christianity which were left over from my reading of the Gospel according to Luke. I asked him, he answered them, and we shared many hours on the phone, just chatting and understanding. And somewhere in the second and third year, eventually, I accepted Christ. And I felt that between the two, that of an incredibly charismatic person and that of being the Son of God, exactly what he described himself to be, I accepted him to be a Son of God.
Did you have some doubts along the way? How did your doubts get answered?
I had many questions. As any good scientist, any researcher would be, I would ask and ask and ask. But I think the biggest leap, the biggest convincing information or the fact or the science, the evidence for it comes from Lee Strobel's question and answer. Lee Strobel's book, The Evidence for Christ, is a fabulous book. And at the end of it all, he said this: there's no way of you knowing Christ unless you jump into it, put your whole body, mind, soul, and strength into it, and then you appreciate Christ for what he was. When you hear that, when you do that, and when you immerse yourself in God and God's wonderful presence, then you see the connection with him. Then you see the friendship he has with you. You see the Father, the loving Father who loves you more than anything else, engulf you. When you have such encounter, then you know for a fact God is real. And when God is real, he doesn't leave you. He's faithful and he helps you, he guides you, and for many occasions in my practice as a physician, I've encounters with him again and again.
In our midst, there might be people who do not know Jesus. So what is something that you will tell them during this Easter?
Christ came 2,000 years ago. He performed miracles then, and he fulfilled what the Bible was to say. And Christ is still very relevant now. As a doctor, I can tell you his miracles are happening every day. It's only for us to see it and for us to recognize it. And then when you become a Christian, you begin to understand how God works in all this. You begin to understand how God has his miracles and performs his miracles. And then when you understand and see his miracles and you see him being real in life, then you have no choice but to accept that such a thing as a spiritual being, all-powerful, that's here that guides us. Only when you experience Christ in the true sense of it, putting your heart, soul, mind, body, totally immersing in it, then will you begin to understand what a great God he is. The only thing which I hope for you is do it early. The earlier you enjoy it, the earlier you understand it, the more you get to savor his goodness, his faithfulness. I can assure you, life is not smooth sailing. In fact, there'll be many encounters, there'll be tides, there'll be storms, and there'll be hurricanes. But one thing I can assure you is, God is going to be with you throughout this time. When you feel lonely, when you feel scared, when you feel worried as if God is quiet, the answer is not. It's you who's not listening, because God is always there. So for the non-believers, jump in, appreciate God for what he is, and then you begin to understand what the real Father you have in heaven that's waiting for you.
Thank you, Dr. Leong. It's been such a blessing to have you with us this Easter Sunday.
Thank you.